All right, guys, this is the Chapter 3, Section 3 notes. That should be your heading for this chapter, or for these notes, I'm sorry. Chapter 3, Section 3 is your heading. These are some objectives for this section. It's all about the Constitution and the powers the Constitution gives. Here are some key terms, some words and their definitions. You won't need to worry about those until I give you the study guide for your test. So this was not your focus question for today. I chose a different focus question, so the slide's kind of irrelevant. So this is going to be the first slide we're going to look at together, the role of Congress. The role of Congress is going to be your first subheading. So what you should know is that Congress has expanded upon basic constitutional provisions. Congress created much of the structure of the federal government. Congress established the federal court system. The Constitution created only the Supreme Court. What else has Congress done since the Constitution? They created many departments and agencies in the executive branch. They've also clarified issues such as the succession of the vice president. So, meaning the succession of power. If the president were to die or if the vice president were to, who would succeed them, who would take their position. So Congress has clarified a lot of those roles. So your next subheading is the powers of Congress. So this is what Congress can do. This is the power of what Congress has allowed to do. We know that Congress passes laws that clarify its own constitutional powers. We know they pass laws, that's their job. But they can pass laws that clarify their own power. So the Constitution describes some congressional powers in vague terms. So the Constitution describes some congressional powers in vague terms. For example, Congress has the power to regulate foreign trade and interstate commerce. It doesn't really say how, so some things had to be clarified in order for it to actually be carried out. So over the years, Congress has passed thousands of laws that detail just what is meant by words like regulate, trade, interstate, and commerce. In the process, it has interpreted the meaning of the Constitution. So by passing some of these laws that describe what these words meant, they're interpreting, Congress is saying, this is what we think they meant in the Constitution. Our next subheading is expanding executive power. So remember, executive branch is the president. So it's expanding the executive power. So presidents have increased their constitutional powers by taking a broad interpretation of the powers the Constitution gives it. So there's certain people who work for presidents or potential presidential candidates who interpret the Constitution in different ways. And so if this guy's telling you that the Constitution says you're allowed to have more power than you do, then obviously you're going to like that person more. You're going to accept their interpretation of the Constitution versus someone else who says, well, the way I interpret the Constitution is that you don't get to have that much power. So depending on who interprets it and what they think, it's usually like lawyers reading it and interpreting it. There's actually jobs where people who just study the Constitution and interpret it to today, that's actually their job. So one of the main things that has happened in recent years, and when I say recent years, I mean like the last 30 years, the expanding the executive power usually involves avoiding the need to gain congressional approval or Congress's approval. So here's a good example. Only Congress is allowed to declare war. It says that in the Constitution. But as commander-in-chief of the military, many presidents have sent military forces into combat without a formal act of war. So they've went ahead and just sent troops into another country into combat, but did not actually get the formal act of war from Congress. So the shows how the executive branch has expanded its power, without really following what the Constitution laid out. Another one is that the Senate must approve formal treaties, but presidents can and do enter into legally binding agreements with foreign leaders all the time without asking for Senate approval, because there's certain interpreters who tell them that the president has this broad executive power and doesn't have to ask for Congress's approval. So that's kind of what our next slide is about. It's about the presidential power. So your next heading is presidential power. The only thing the Constitution says, okay, so the Constitution grants the president executive power. Most presidents argue that this power includes the authority to do things not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So they feel as though it gives them the authority to do things not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And it gives us an example about Thomas Jefferson when he was president. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, used this justification to get the new territory for the United States when he purchased the Louisiana Territory. Even though Congress didn't approve it, he used that broad executive power given to him by the Constitution, interpreted it meaning he did not need Congress's approval to do so. So that's one example of the broad presidential power. So another thing that the president's required to do by the Constitution is the State of the Union address. And it's where they address Congress and they address the nation. So the address to Congress is required by the Constitution. The method or the way is left up to each president. So this guy over here, Harry Truman, he was the first president to televise his State of the Union address, and today the State of the Union address is always televised, and it's the president speaking not only to Congress but also to the American citizens. So it's required of the president to address Congress, but today the custom has just become that they also address the nation because it's televised. So your next subheading is the courts. So this is the judicial branch. What powers do they have? So the courts, the nation's courts, particularly the Supreme Court, interpret the Constitution on a regular basis. So what do the courts do? They interpret the Constitution on a regular basis. In the last section, we talked about judicial review and how it gives the court the power to declare laws unconstitutional. So that's one of the things they have. They have the power of judicial review. It allows them to declare laws unconstitutional. They also can declare that a law is constitutional, and that also involves interpreting the Constitution to say, is this law constitutional or not? Does it go on the Constitution? So the courts interpret the Constitution on a regular basis. And each type of ruling sets a precedent for interpreting future laws. So if the Supreme Court rules one way, then they can also use that same justification for hearings that will happen thereafter. All right, your next subheading is about political parties. So we know the parties, there's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's independents, right? So there's different political parties in the United States. Mainly the two main political parties are Republican and Democrat. The one thing you need to know is that the Constitution does not mention political parties anywhere. There is no listing of any type of political party in the Constitution. And this is also important. Most of the framers of the Constitution actually opposed political parties because they feared that they would end up dividing the government. And they were kind of right. That is what has kind of happened with political parties. People becoming affiliated with certain political parties has been able to divide the countries in some ways. So again, it's just political parties continued. So even though the framers weren't a fan of political parties and they feared political parties dividing the country, political parties are very influential in our political process. The daily business and committee systems of Congress are organized around party membership. So Congress are organized around party membership. So political parties have become such a big thing in our government that Congress actually organizes its system and its committees based on party membership, even though political parties are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. So again, just political parties continued. The Constitution says nothing about the nomination process, being nominated for president. The political parties use state primaries and national conventions to choose candidates. Parties also influence the selection of electors to the Electoral College. So parties influence electors to the Electoral College. Party membership influences president's decision-making when choosing political appointees. So party membership influences the president when choosing political appointees. They usually are only going to appoint members that are of the same political affiliation of them. So you can see just how much political parties influence our government, even though the political parties and the system of the political parties were never mentioned in the Constitution. So your next heading is customs. Unwritten customs can be just as influential as written laws. So, for example, the president's cabinet, where they pick the members like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and all the different positions, they exist solely as a result of custom rather than any law. There's no law that says the president has to do that. That's a custom that the presidents follow, even though it's not written down anywhere. The custom of senatorial courtesy guides the appointment of public officials. So customs continued. Ever since George Washington, presidents had limited themselves to 2 terms in office. So ever since George Washington, presidents had limited themselves to 2 4-year terms. 2 4-year terms. That was just the custom that George Washington set. But a guy named FDR, or Franklin Roosevelt, he was elected, or you can say FDR. FDR was elected to 4 consecutive terms from 1932 to 1944. So while he was president, the 2-term limit passage of the 22nd Amendment in 1951 was passed because they feared that he was becoming like a king, that he would continue to be elected to all of these terms. So he is the only president in the history of the United States to not follow the custom of 2 terms. And now it's a law that you can't. 2 terms is all there is. And that happened in 1951 with the passage of the 22nd Amendment. So customs continued. So for years, the vice president assumed the office of the presidency when the president died, but that was not a formal law until 1957. The passage of the 25th Amendment in 1967 made the succession of vice president to president in case of the death of the president a law. It was just a custom up until 1967. And that is all for our notes for today. Please take a picture if you did it on paper and submit that to this assignment, or you can, if you chose to type it, you can submit the document that you typed on. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message. Thank you.